I stared at the phone screen, my thumb hovering over the call button for what felt like an eternity. 3 months of planning, 3 months of dreaming, and it all came crashing down with 6 words from my father. "We won't pay for your wedding. It's a circus." The Atlanta summer heat pressed against the windows of my apartment, but the chill in my chest had nothing to do with the weather. I had called him with such excitement, ready to share the final details of what I thought would be the most beautiful day of my life. Instead, his voice had cut through my joy like a blade through silk. The venue coordinator had been so understanding when I called to cancel everything this morning. "Are you sure, Miss Thompson?" she had asked, her southern accent thick with genuine concern. "The Magnolia Gardens has been booked solid for months. This is quite sudden." I couldn't bring myself to explain that my own father thought my wedding was nothing more than an elaborate joke. How do you tell a stranger that the man who raised you, who taught you to ride a bike and helped with homework, had just crushed your dreams without a second thought? The shame burned in my throat as I mumbled something about family circumstances and hung up. My fiancé Marcus had been nothing but supportive, his arms wrapped around me as I sobbed into his chest last night. "We'll figure this out, Rachel," he whispered into my hair, his voice steady despite the uncertainty we both felt. "Maybe we can have a smaller ceremony, something more intimate." But it wasn't about the size or the cost. It was about my father's complete dismissal of something that meant everything to me. The way he had laughed, actually laughed, when I described the flower arrangements and the string quartet. "You're 26 years old, Rachel, not 16. This fairy tale nonsense needs to stop." I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the bustling streets of Midtown Atlanta, watching people hurry past with their own dreams and disappointments. My father William had always been practical, sometimes brutally so, but this felt different. This felt personal. Growing up, he had been my hero, a successful architect who built beautiful homes for other families while somehow never quite building the emotional foundation I needed in our own. My mother had passed when I was 12, and since then, it had been just the two of us navigating life together, or so I thought. The wedding dress hanging in my closet seemed to mock me now, its ivory silk catching the afternoon light streaming through my bedroom door. I had found it at a boutique in Buckhead, and the moment I put it on, I felt like the woman I was meant to become. The saleswoman had tears in her eyes when she zipped it up, telling me I looked radiant. "Your father is going to cry when he sees you walking down that aisle," she had said with such certainty. If only she knew that my father would never get the chance to see me in it, because he had decided my wedding wasn't worth his time or money. Marcus and I had been together for 3 years, and I had never doubted that my father approved of him. They got along well, talking about sports and work whenever Marcus came over for dinner. William had even helped Marcus pick out my engagement ring, or so Marcus had told me. So why was he suddenly treating our wedding like some childish fantasy? The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. This wasn't just about money. My father was well off, and the wedding wasn't extravagantly expensive. There was something else, something he wasn't telling me. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through the photos I had taken at the venue during our initial visit. The Magnolia Gardens was everything I had dreamed of. A historic mansion with sprawling gardens, ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and a gazebo that looked like something out of a romance novel. The coordinator had shown us the ballroom where we would have our reception, with its crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. "Many couples have started their forever here," she had said with a warm smile. "There's something magical about this place." As the sun began to set over Atlanta's skyline, painting my apartment in shades of gold and amber, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let my father's inexplicable rejection define my future. Tomorrow, I would start making calls, looking for ways to make our wedding happen without his financial support. Marcus and I had some savings, and maybe we could find a smaller venue, something more modest but still meaningful. I refused to let my father's sudden coldness steal the joy from what should be the beginning of my new life. Little did I know that tomorrow would bring a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about my father and the secrets he had been keeping. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop, researching alternative wedding venues. I had barely slept, my mind racing with questions about my father's sudden change of heart and worry about how Marcus and I would manage to pull together a wedding on our limited budget. The rain tapped against my windows like impatient fingers, and I found myself checking my phone every few minutes, hoping for some miracle or maybe just a text from my father explaining his harsh words. But the screen remained stubbornly blank, just like the communication between us had become overnight. I was deep into browsing a modest community center's rental rates when my phone finally rang. For a split second, my heart leaped, thinking it might be William calling to apologize, to tell me he had been having a bad day and didn't mean what he said. Instead, the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, though something about it seemed familiar. "Hello?" I answered, my voice still hoarse from crying. "Miss Thompson? This is Margaret from Magnolia Gardens. I hope I'm not calling too early." My stomach dropped, wondering if there was some cancellation fee I had forgotten about. Another financial blow to add to my growing list of problems. "I wanted to follow up on your cancellation yesterday," Margaret continued, her voice carrying that same warm, southern charm that had made me fall in love with the venue in the first place. "I have to admit, I was quite surprised. You and your fiancé seemed so excited about having your wedding here, and everything was progressing so smoothly." I closed my eyes, not wanting to relive the embarrassment of having to cancel my dream wedding because my own father thought it was ridiculous. "Yes, well, family circumstances changed," I managed to say, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I understand these things happen, but I'm afraid there's been a development." Margaret's tone shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "Miss Thompson, I hope you don't mind, but after we spoke yesterday, I looked up your father's information in our system. William Thompson, correct?" My heart began to race for reasons I couldn't quite understand. Why would she be looking up my father's information? "Yes, that's right," I said slowly, setting down my coffee cup with trembling hands. "Well, dear, this is quite unusual, but I felt I needed to call him directly. You see, when couples cancel, especially so close to their date, we typically reach out to all parties involved to ensure there are no misunderstandings about our policies." The rain outside seemed to grow heavier, drumming against my windows with increasing intensity. "I called your father this morning," Margaret continued, and I could hear something strange in her voice, a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't identify. "Miss Thompson, I think there might be more to this situation than you realize. Your father, well, he had quite a reaction when I mentioned the Magnolia Gardens. He became very quiet, and then he asked me something that struck me as odd. He wanted to know if the old oak tree by the gazebo was still there, the one with the heart carved into it." My breath caught in my throat. How could my father know about that tree? I had noticed it during our venue tour, but I had never mentioned it to him. "I've been working at Magnolia Gardens for over 20 years, Margaret said, her voice taking on a storytelling quality that made me lean forward in my chair. "And in all that time, I've only heard a few people ask about that specific tree. It's not something we typically point out during tours. It's quite old, and the carving is faded. But your father knew about it, and when I confirmed it was still there, he went completely silent. Then he asked me something that gave me chills. Is the name Sarah still visible in the heart?" My hand flew to my mouth, and I felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Sarah. That was my mother's name. I tried to speak, but no words came out. Margaret seemed to understand my shock and continued gently. "Miss Thompson, I think your father has a history with our venue that he hasn't shared with you." After he asked about the tree, he became very emotional. I could hear it in his voice even over the phone. "He asked me not to mention our conversation to you, but I felt you deserved to know. There's something about the Magnolia Gardens that means a great deal to your father, something connected to someone named Sarah." The pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed began to form in my mind, creating a picture that both thrilled and terrified me. As Margaret's words sank in, I realized that my father's rejection of my wedding might not have been about the money or his disapproval of my choices at all. It might have been about something much deeper, something painful that he had been carrying alone for years. The venue I had chosen for my new beginning might have been the place where his own love story had unfolded, and perhaps ended. I thanked Margaret for calling and promised to think about everything she had told me. But as I hung up the phone, I knew there was only one thing I could do. I had to confront my father and demand the truth about Sarah, about the tree, and about why the place where I wanted to start my forever was apparently where his own heart had been broken. I drove through the familiar streets of Buckhead toward my father's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The rain had stopped, but dark clouds still hung low over Atlanta, threatening another downpour that would match the storm brewing in my chest. Every traffic light seemed to take forever, giving me too much time to think about what Margaret had told me and what it might mean. My mother Sarah had died when I was 12, and in all the years since, my father had rarely spoken about their relationship or their life together before I was born. I had always assumed it was too painful for him, but now I wondered if there were secrets he had been protecting me from. The Tudor-style house where I grew up came into view, its red brick facade and perfectly manicured lawn looking exactly as it had for the past 20 years. My father was meticulous about maintaining everything in his life, his home, his business, his reputation. But apparently, he had been less careful about maintaining honesty with his only daughter. I sat in the driveway for several minutes, watching the windows for any sign of movement, trying to gather the courage to walk up to that familiar front door and demand answers about a past I was only now learning existed. The house looked peaceful, almost serene, but I knew that was about to change. William answered the door on the second knock, his expression shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like resignation when he saw my face. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" he asked, but his voice lacked its usual authority. He looked older somehow, as if our conversation yesterday had aged him overnight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had slept as poorly as I had. "We need to talk, Dad," I said, pushing past him into the foyer where family photos lined the walls. Photos that suddenly seemed to tell only half the story of our lives. About the Magnolia Gardens, about Mom, and about why you really don't want me to get married there. I watched my father's face carefully as I mentioned the venue, and I saw it, a flicker of pain that he tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he closed the front door with more force than necessary, as if he could shut out the conversation we were about to have. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice was weak, unconvincing. "The venue coordinator called you this morning, didn't she?" I pressed, following him into the living room, where my mother's portrait still hung above the fireplace, her gentle smile now seeming to hold secrets I had never noticed before. "She told you about the oak tree, about the heart with Sarah's name carved into it." The color drained from my father's face, and he sank into his favorite armchair as if his legs could no longer support him. For a moment he looked like a broken man, rather than the strong, successful architect who had raised me single-handedly for 14 years. "How did you—" he started, then stopped, running his hands through his graying hair. "Margaret has been there for 20 years, Dad. She remembers things, she remembers people. She remembers you asking about that tree." I sat down across from him, my heart pounding as I prepared to hear truths that would change everything I thought I knew about my parents' love story. "Your mother and I," William began, then stopped, staring at the portrait above the fireplace as if Sarah herself might give him permission to finally tell their story. "We were so young when we met. I was 22, fresh out of architecture school, and she was 20, working as a florist in Virginia Highland. The Magnolia Gardens was where I proposed to her, under that oak tree, on a spring evening in 1995. I carved our initials into the bark that night, inside a heart, because I thought we would be together forever." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and I felt my own eyes filling with tears as I began to understand the magnitude of what he had been carrying alone. "We planned our wedding for the following spring," he continued, his gaze never leaving my mother's portrait. "Sarah had it all mapped out. The ceremony in the gardens, the reception in the ballroom, even the flowers she would arrange herself. She was so excited, so full of dreams and plans. But 3 weeks before the wedding, she was diagnosed with a rare heart condition. The doctor said the stress of a big wedding, the excitement, the physical demands, it could be dangerous. They recommended we postpone everything until she was stronger." I watched my father's hands tremble as he spoke, and I realized I was witnessing him relive the most painful period of his life. "We never had that wedding, Rachel," William said, finally looking at me with eyes full of unshed tears. "We got married in a small ceremony at the hospital chapel instead, with just a few family members present. Sarah wore a simple white dress, not the elaborate gown she had dreamed of. She never got to walk down that aisle at Magnolia Gardens, never got to dance in that ballroom under those chandeliers. She died believing she had missed out on the wedding of her dreams, and I've carried that guilt for 26 years. The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place, and I understood why my father had reacted so strongly to my wedding plans. It wasn't about the money or his disapproval. It was about the unbearable pain of watching his daughter plan the exact wedding his beloved wife never got to have. The silence in the living room was deafening after my father's revelation, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to my grandmother. I stared at him, this man who had raised me with such strength and determination, and realized I was seeing him truly vulnerable for the first time in my adult life. The weight of his secret, carried for over 2 decades, seemed to fill the space between us like a living thing. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "why didn't you ever tell me?" He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so unlike the composed man I knew that it broke my heart all over again. "How could I tell you that your mother died believing she had failed at something as simple as having the wedding she dreamed of?" William asked, his voice raw with emotion. "How could I explain that every time I looked at wedding magazines or heard you talk about your plans, I saw her face on that hospital bed, apologizing to me for not being strong enough to have the ceremony she wanted? She made me promise that if we ever had a daughter, I would make sure she had everything Sarah couldn't have. But when you chose the Magnolia Gardens," his voice trailed off, and I saw him struggling with the impossible position he had put himself in. I moved from my chair to sit on the arm of his, something I hadn't done since I was a little girl seeking comfort after a nightmare. "She would want me to be happy, Dad," I said softly, placing my hand on his shoulder. "Mom would want me to have the wedding of my dreams, even if it's at the same place where hers couldn't happen." William looked up at me with such pain in his eyes that I almost regretted pushing him to tell me the truth. "But don't you see, Rachel? Every detail you described, the flowers, the gazebo, the ballroom, it's exactly what she planned. It's like watching her ghost live out the dreams she never got to fulfill, and I can't bear the thought of being there, of walking you down that aisle she never got to walk down." The complexity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. My father wasn't trying to hurt me or dismiss my dreams. He was drowning in grief and guilt that had been festering for 26 years. "What did Margaret say when you asked about the tree?" I asked, needing to understand the full scope of what had transpired during their phone call. William's expression grew even more pained, if that was possible. "She said the carving was still there, faded but visible. She said many couples over the years have noticed it and asked about it, wondering who Sarah and William were. She said it had become something of a romantic legend at the venue, the mysterious couple whose love was literally carved into the heart of the gardens." I felt a strange mixture of sadness and wonder wash over me. My parents' love story had become part of the fabric of the place where I wanted to begin my own, their initials serving as a blessing for countless other couples who had married there over the years. "Dad, what if this isn't a coincidence?" I asked, the idea forming even as I spoke. "What if Mom somehow guided me to choose this place? What if she wants to be part of my wedding day, even though she can't be there physically?" William shook his head, but I could see something shifting in his expression, a crack in the wall of grief he had built around his heart. "Margaret said something else," William admitted reluctantly. "She said that in all her years at the venue, she had never seen a bride light up the way you did during your tour. She said you seemed to belong there, like the gardens themselves were welcoming you home." When I heard that, he paused, struggling with emotions that were clearly overwhelming him. It was like hearing about Sarah all over again. She had that same joy, that same sense of belonging when we first visited the Magnolia Gardens. It was as if the place had been waiting for her. Just like Margaret said, it seemed to be waiting for you. The rain had started again outside, gentle drops against the windows that seemed to echo the tears flowing down both our faces. "I want you to come with me to see the tree," I said suddenly, the words surprising even me. "I want you to show me where you proposed to Mom, where you carved your initials. I want to understand this place that means so much to both of us, even if we didn't realize it until now." William looked at me with a mixture of fear and longing, as if the idea both terrified and tempted him. "Rachel, I don't know if I can handle going back there. I've avoided that place for 26 years. You don't have to handle it alone," I said, taking his hand in mine. "We'll go together and we'll figure out how to honor Mom's memory while still celebrating my future. Maybe there's a way to have my wedding there that includes her, that makes her part of the day instead of a painful absence." As I spoke, I realized I was asking my father to do something incredibly difficult, to face his deepest grief and transform it into something that could coexist with joy. But I also knew that if we could find a way to do this together, it might finally give him the peace he had been seeking for over 2 decades and give me the wedding that would truly honor both my past and my future. 2 days later, I found myself standing in the parking lot of Magnolia Gardens with my father, both of us staring at the elegant entrance as if it might disappear if we looked away. William's hands were shaking slightly, and I could see him taking deep breaths, preparing himself for what we both knew would be an emotional journey into his past. Margaret had agreed to meet us personally, understanding the delicate nature of our visit, and I spotted her walking toward us with a gentle smile that somehow conveyed both sympathy and hope. "Are you ready for this, Dad?" I asked, linking my arm through his the way I used to when I was little and needed his strength. "I don't think anyone can ever be ready to revisit their greatest joy and deepest sorrow in the same place," he replied, but he squeezed my arm and took the first step forward. Margaret led us through the gardens slowly, pointing out changes that had been made over the years, while my father nodded silently, his eyes taking in every detail with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile memory with reality. The Spanish moss still draped the ancient oaks like nature's own wedding veils, and the scent of magnolia blossoms filled the air with a sweetness that seemed almost sacred. "The gazebo has been restored twice since the 90s, Margaret explained, as we approached the structure where I had envisioned saying my vows. "But we've kept the original design because it's so beloved by couples." When we reached the oak tree with the carved heart, my father stopped walking entirely, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the faded but still visible initials that proclaimed his and my mother's love to the world. I watched him reach out tentatively to trace the letters with his fingertip, and I saw 26 years of grief begin to transform into something that looked almost like peace. "She would have loved seeing you here," William said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he continued to stare at the carving. "Sarah always said this tree was magical, that it held the dreams of everyone who had ever stood beneath it and made promises of forever." Margaret discreetly stepped back to give us privacy, but I could see tears in her eyes as she watched my father reconnect with this place that had shaped his understanding of love and loss. "I can feel her here, Dad," I whispered, and I meant it. There was something about standing in this spot that made me feel connected to the mother I had lost so young, as if her spirit had been waiting in this garden for me to find my way back to her. Maybe that's why I was drawn to this place without even knowing its significance to our family. My father looked at me then with an expression of wonder, as if he was seeing me not just as his daughter, but as Sarah's daughter too, carrying forward a legacy of love that transcended death itself. As we walked back toward the main building, my father began to share memories he had kept locked away for decades, how my mother had insisted on visiting the gardens in every season before their planned wedding, how she had sketched ideas for flower arrangements in a notebook she carried everywhere, how she had made him promise that someday their children would know this place and understand what it meant to love someone completely. "I think I've been afraid that having your wedding here would somehow diminish what your mother and I shared," he admitted as we paused by the fountain where koi fish swam lazily in the afternoon sun. "But listening to you talk about your dreams, seeing how this place calls to you the same way it called to her, maybe it's not about replacing her memory, but about continuing the love story she started." I felt something shift between us in that moment, a healing that had been 26 years in the making, and I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together as a family united, rather than divided by grief. When Margaret rejoined us at the entrance, my father surprised both of us by asking about availability for my original wedding date, his voice steady, despite the emotional journey we had just taken. "I want to walk my daughter down the aisle, where I should have walked her mother," he said, and I saw Margaret's professional composure crack as she smiled through her own tears. "I want Sarah to be part of this day, not as a ghost haunting our happiness, but as the foundation of love that made this moment possible." As we drove home together, my father and I began planning not just a wedding, but a celebration that would honor the past while embracing the future, and I realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that span generations, connecting hearts across time and space in ways that seem almost too perfect to be mere coincidence. The Magnolia Gardens would indeed host my wedding, but now it would be so much more than just a venue. It would be a sacred space where my family's love story would continue to unfold. one generation blessing the next under the watchful branches of an old oak tree that had been keeping our secret safe all along.